I had heard a knock on the door, but when I opened it, no one was there. I looked around. Nothing. Then I looked down and saw it. Lying there on the doorstep was an old cell phone with a cracked screen. I picked it up and clicked the home button. It opened without a passcode, revealing a home screen with only one app. "Rebecca?" I called out to my 18-year-old daughter as I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. "You know anything about the cell phone I just found on the doorstep?" "On the doorstep?" She called back from the living room, likely scrolling away on her own phone. "Yeah, with a big crack in it?" "Nope." "I guess I'll just throw it out then." "Wait, I want to see!" She cried out, her curiosity piqued, as she made her way over to the kitchen. I held it up for her to see. "You. Looks old. Like from when you and Mom were growing up." "When your mom and I were growing up, there were no cell phones, Becca." "Sounds boring." "Yeah, it was. Perfectly boring. In the best way possible. Now look at what's become of the world." Yeah, let me see it," she said, snatching the old cracked cell phone out my hand. "What's the passcode?" "There isn't one." She opened it. "Just one app? This phone is so mid." "Mid?" I asked, unfamiliar with her Gen Z slang. "It means like mediocre, Dad. Where'd you find this thing anyway?" "I told you, on the doorstep. Someone knocked and ran away." "So, it's some sort of prank?" "If it is, it's a pretty mid-prank," I replied, giving her the same smug look I always did when I landed a dad joke. Your jokes are not funny, Dad. Anyways, I'm gonna see what's in the app," Rebecca said, as she scurried off back to the living room and proceeded to scroll away on the cracked old phone. "Cool. Let me know what you find, Becca," I said casually, as I sat back down at the dinner table and continued reading my newspaper. An hour or so later, my wife Erica returned home from work, and we had dinner. "Rebecca, it's dinner time," Erica called out from the kitchen. But my daughter didn't reply. "Becca?" I added. But again, Rebecca ignored us. My wife and I both looked at each other and rolled our eyes. "Your loss. Food'll be cold again," Erica said, referring to the countless other times our social media-obsessed teen had forgone dinner so long that the meal had become cold. "Kids," I muttered under my breath. "So how was work, honey?" A few hours later, my wife and I decided to go upstairs for the night and, seeing that Rebecca was still scrolling away on the couch, reminded her that her dinner was on the table. Once again, our daughter just ignored us as she continued to scroll away on her phone. Something that, after raising an 18-year-old daughter, I was very used to. But this time, something was different. This time, she was scrolling on a different phone. The old cracked phone I had found on the doorstep, to be precise. She's still using that old thing? Wonder what app was on there. Must be some game or social media thing, I thought to myself. "Just remember to turn the lights out before you go to bed, Becca," my wife called down before we retired to our bedroom to no reply. But the next morning, not only did we find the lights on, but we also found Rebecca still sitting there. Sure enough, scrolling away on the old cracked phone. "Rebecca," my wife called out. "Did you even sleep last night?" "Yeah, Becca, you really shouldn't be pulling all-nighters like that," I added as I went to the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. But before I could make it that far, something caught my eye on the kitchen table. To my disbelief, there was Rebecca's dinner, still sitting there, completely untouched. That's when I knew that something was very wrong. By the time my wife and I were able to pry the old, cracked cell phone out of our daughter's hands, Rebecca had gone into a sudden fit of rage. "Give it back," she screamed, her eyes cold and lifeless. I tossed the phone to Erica behind me, while I stood between her and our daughter. "I said, give it back!" Rebecca screamed again in a threatening fashion. Becca, what's gotten into you? It's just an old phone, and a cracked one at that, I began. But before I could continue, my innocent daughter, who had never laid a finger on a soul her entire life, suddenly lunged at me, swung her arm and ran her nails across my face, tearing the flesh from my skin and causing blood to pour down my neck. "Rebecca!" I yelled, raising my voice. But it was too late. She had already hopped over me and chased my wife into the kitchen. When I finally caught up to her at the entrance to the kitchen, I saw my daughter standing there with a steak knife on one side of the kitchen table, while my wife stood on the other, shaking in fear as she held the old cracked phone in her hand. What was on that app? I asked hypothetically out loud, realizing that whatever my daughter had discovered on the phone must have been the cause of her 14-hour doom scroll and subsequent fit of rage. But Erica must have taken me literally, immediately opening the phone and going to the app. I saw a perplexed look wash over my wife's face as she took her finger, placed it on the phone's cracked surface, and started to scroll. "No! Erica, stop!" I cried out as I ran over to her and ripped the phone from her hand. But before I could even process what had happened, I heard the steak knife that my daughter was holding fall to the kitchen floor before she too collapsed to the ground. "Becca?" I asked, confused by her sudden change of disposition, but at the same time, relieved that her fit of rage had ceased. That's when I heard a growl behind me, as my daughter's rage had somehow shifted to my wife, and Erica picked up the knife from the floor. "Give it back!" my wife screamed, her eyes now cold and lifeless. I looked down at my daughter, who looked as if she had just awoken from a trance. That's when I realized that whatever curse had been bestowed upon the old cracked phone's app seemed to only affect the last person who used it. I took my dazed daughter by the hand and led her out of the kitchen, out of the house, and to the driveway, as my wife followed, still wielding the knife. "Get in," I insisted as I opened my car door, and Rebecca hopped inside before I used my key fob to lock her inside. "Give me the phone," my wife cried from behind me as she swung the knife at me. I stepped aside and watched its blade pierce the hood of my car. I thought to call out my wife's name in an attempt to snap her out of it, but immediately realizing that there was only one way to snap her out of her trance. As she struggled to pull the blade out of the car, I seized the opportunity to run back in the house and turn on the sink in the first-floor bathroom. Eventually, my wife came back inside looking for me and, sure enough, headed for the source of the running water. And when she stepped inside, I hopped out from behind the kitchen island, slamming the door behind her, before dragging a nearby bookshelf against the door and reinforcing it with a few other heavy objects. "Give me the phone," I heard her cry out from inside the bathroom, as I looked at the old cracked cell phone that I was still gripping in my hand, and knew what I had to do. 30 minutes later, the deed was done. The old cracked cell phone left on a random neighbor's doorstep in the next town over, where I hoped no one would recognize me. When I got back to the car, my daughter was just sitting there in the passenger seat, still traumatized and speechless from what she had just gone through. We drove home in silence. And when we finally got back, we waited by the barricaded bathroom door as my wife continued to scream. And waited. And waited. Until eventually, she stopped. I slid the heavy objects and bookshelf aside and opened the bathroom door to find Erica just standing there, as if waking from a bad dream, the same exhausted expression on her face that I'd seen previously on my daughter. It had worked. My wife was no longer possessed by the vile device. Erica walked over and hugged me. I looked over at my daughter. She smiled. I smiled back. In that moment, two things became clear. One, someone else had been possessed by the phone prior to leaving it on my doorstep. Two, someone new was possessed by it now. But all that mattered to me in that moment was that my family was okay. I wish I could say that after the dust settled, my daughter swore off cell phones, social media, and apps altogether. But the truth is, it only took a day before she was back to doom scrolling on her own phone. Now every time she does and her dinner gets cold, I can't help but fear that she's been possessed again. But then I realize she's just a teenager.